All right. And we are live, coming right out of the session with Denise now to a conversation with Taya Cohen. Taya is a tenured associate professor of organizational behavior and theory at Tepper, is currently serving as the president of the International Association for Conflict Management. And she does research on honesty, moral behavior, negotiation, conflict, and particularly known for her research on moral character in the workplace, which is what she's going to talk to us about today. Thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my research on hiring for moral character. So when I use this phrase moral character, I'm talking about an individual's disposition to think, feel, and behave in an ethical manner. So the aspect of a person's personality associated with morality and ethics. And there's three sort of broad categories of characteristics that you can think of that might fall under this umbrella of moral character. You can think of a person's motivation to do good and avoid doing bad, right? Their moral motivation. Some people are really concerned about harming others, or about not harming others, about helping others, right? That would fall under this moral motivation. And then there's an ability element, right? You might have the best of intentions, but if you can't follow through on them, you're not going to be able to be ethical in situations that are very tempting to do the wrong thing. So you can think of this as self-control, self-regulation, right? The ability to do good and avoid doing bad. And then there's this identity component. For some people, it's a core part of who they are, right? It's how they see themselves. And so we can think of that as moral identity. And so there's variability among all of us, right? Most people may fall somewhere in the middle on each of these aspects of moral character. You see of some, maybe moral exemplars, the most moral people you can think of who are going to be on the high end. And then, of course, there's the bottom, say 10%, 20%. Those are the people that do a lot of damage in organizations. And when we think about hiring for moral character, we really want to avoid hiring those people at the bottom and focus on sort of hiring people who are on the higher end of moral character. And so, thinking about personality, moral character, it's of course important to acknowledge that organizational culture, of course, also exerts a powerful influence on ethical behavior. But what we know about moral character in the workplace, that some people act in consistently more ethical ways than others in different situations and over time, even in the face of pressure or temptation to do otherwise. And so what are the characteristics of these people? People with higher levels of moral character are considerate of others. They tend to be trustworthy, honest. They care about doing the right thing. They think about the possible future consequences of their choices. And the characteristic that I've spent most of my research time over the past decade studying is what is called guilt-proneness. And it's the idea of some people have a stronger conscience than others. So when they do something wrong, they feel bad about their behavior. They try to correct for what they did, even if no one knows about it. So hiring people with these characteristics, it's important for creating an ethical workplace and also for building an inclusive one in which people feel welcome. Right? If we hire people who are more considerate of others, who think about their actions, it's going to help on a lot of dimensions in the organization. So I want to tell you a little bit about some of my research on guilt-proneness and what it's related to, how to measure it, and I'll end with talking about kinds of questions that might allow you to get a glimpse of a person's guilt-proneness in the interview process. So guilt-proneness is a moral character trait. It captures the extent to which a person would feel bad about their behavior if they did something wrong, even if no one knew about what had happened. Right? So highly guilt-prone people feel bad about their mistakes, their transgressions when they harm others, especially if those actions negatively impact others. Right? And they're able to anticipate these feelings before they behave badly. And that's really important because that helps them act more responsibly and ethically. Right? So not only do they feel more guilty after they've done something wrong, but because they can anticipate this, it helps them from doing the wrong thing to begin with. So people with high levels of this character trait feel a great sense of interpersonal responsibility. And as you might imagine, if a person feels a great sense of interpersonal responsibility, they're going to be a more trustworthy employee. They're going to make a better leader. So here is just one example of some findings from my own work on guilt-proneness. And this graph here shows counterproductive work behaviors, what you might think of as workplace deviance. So these are all the kinds of behaviors in organizations that harm either the organization or people within it. Right? So I have some examples here on the slide about everything from stealing and wasting materials to being nasty or rude to clients or customers. In one study, I surveyed people over the course of 3 months. Every week for 3 months, they filled out a survey and they indicated how frequently they did a variety of these bad behaviors, also other positive behaviors like helping, and their experiences at work more generally. I also had them invite a coworker to take a survey about them, where the coworker answered questions about how this employee had behaved over the past month. And we were able to link that to some moral character assessments that we took in the beginning of the study. So at the beginning of the study, they filled out the big battery of personality measures, including guilt-proneness, and then every week for the following 12 weeks, they reported on their behavior. And what you can see here is that the employees who are in the bottom 25th percentile, the lower end of guilt-proneness, they were doing a lot more bad behaviors. They were self-reporting a lot more. And also, if you look at on the right, their coworkers' reports about them over the course of a month, their coworkers said they were doing a lot more of these bad behaviors. Whereas the employees who had relatively high moral character, in here I have it graphed as the upper quartile, the top 25th percentile, they did one or two of these, but not too many. And so there's a pretty big difference because these behaviors, some of them are small, some of them are more consequential, but when they, in aggregate, right, they can cause a lot of damage. And there's all kinds of estimates about, trying to put dollar values in the millions and billions of dollars these kinds of behaviors can cost organizations. So if you wanted to get a sense of, is a person high or low in guilt-proneness, what could you look for? So here's some questions you can think about. Would the person feel guilty about committing a transgression or making a mistake, even if no one knew about what they did? Would they feel bad about letting others down or harming them, even if it was not done intentionally? And does the person have a strong sense of responsibility for others? Now, in research studies, this slide may be a little small, but this is a simple 5-item questionnaire that I've developed and used in a lot of my research on the topic. And here, it's important to keep in mind that this is in research where people are anonymous. It's a survey, right? It's not linked to their hiring or promotion. So people are quite willing to be honest. And so we ask people questions to imagine themselves in these situations. After realizing you received too much change at a store, you decide to keep it because the sales clerk doesn't notice. What's the likelihood you'd feel uncomfortable about keeping the money? And many people might say it's about a 50% likely, maybe 4 likely. And then you have some that would say, yeah, I feel really bad, extremely likely. And then there's a smaller proportion of people that would say 1 or 2, extremely unlikely or unlikely. And it turns out that the people who, over these 5 questions, answer 1s and 2s, they're the ones who are doing a lot more of those bad behaviors in organizations. Also, leadership. And so, as part of my teaching a few years ago, I was teaching all of our first-year MBA students at the Tepper school. And we were doing a unit on personality and leadership. And so they filled out this guilt-proneness questionnaire, and as well as some others to do some self-reflections. At the end of the course, they rated one another on leadership after they had done other group projects, other things where they got to know each other. And here is data from a little over 200 MBA students where they rated each other on leadership, which here I have defined as the ability to build and maintain a group that performs well relative to its competition. And so they checked the names of classmates whom they regarded as highly effective leaders. And what we can see here with these data is that the students who had reported being lower in guilt-proneness at the beginning of the semester, later on at the end of the semester, received fewer ratings of being effective leaders, whereas those who had relatively high scores on guilt-proneness were rated as more effective leaders. And the key characteristic that's been identified both in my work and some work by Rebecca Schomburg at Wharton and Frank Flynn at Stanford is that these students and leaders more generally have a higher sense of personal responsibility. Right? Guilt-proneness is linked to a sense of personal responsibility, and that's linked to leadership, more effective leadership. So guilt-proneness is one particular character trait. It's related to this broader dimension of personality that we call the H factor. The H factor stands for honesty, humility. It's a broad dimension that encompasses people's concerns for and tendencies towards fairness, sincerity, modesty, and avoidance of greed. And so more generally than just guilt-proneness, can you think about, is the person honest, humble, and fair? Or are they Machiavellian, narcissistic, and callous? Is the person considerate of others in the organization, mindful of how their choices affect others? Right, so these are all questions when you're thinking about moral character. What is it? It's sort of this abstract construct, but you can think of these various characteristics. And so there's a question in the chat, so previewing, I think, this slide in terms of behavioral interviewing. And I think this is a really important question, right? Because self-reports are all well and good for research when people aren't motivated to misrepresent or fake good, right? But what can you do in practice when people are going to be very motivated to make a positive impression? Is there more subtle or indirect ways that might reveal a person's moral character, their guilt-proneness, this H factor of personality, other related characteristics? So with a former doctoral student of mine, Young Jung Kim, we studied some behavioral interview questions, and there were two that we have found in our research that do a good job at eliciting cues about a person's moral character, that observers can evaluate people's responses and make a somewhat accurate judgment of a person's moral character. I don't think these are necessarily the only two questions you could ask, but they give you a sense of the kinds of questions that might give you information about character. So one we call the mistake question. So please tell me about a time when you made a mistake at work. How did you feel when this occurred? What did you do? What, if anything, did you learn from this experience? And the second one, please describe an experience in which you're faced with a difficult dilemma at your job, a situation where you found it hard to decide what to do. What factors did you consider? What did you do? What, if anything, did you learn from the experience? And so I see some people in the chat, thank you, Stephen Spolar, are saying you've used these frequently. And I think we modeled these on the kinds of questions that are used in practice. And what's important is to think about what kinds of things do people write about, right? Do they write about feeling bad about what they did, even if maybe no one knew about it? Did they write about this sense of responsibility? What are the factors they considered? Do they consider other people, or is it just the consequences for themselves? And so we've run a number of different studies where we've had interviewees answer these questions, and then we had raters, I think of evaluators, read people's responses and make a judgment of the person's moral character. And so here is one study we ran where we had the interviewees, that's called targets here, respond about their counterproductive work behaviors, those same kinds of behaviors I showed you at the beginning of the talk. And as you can see, the people who are rated low on moral character, either with the mistake question or the dilemma, we don't see big differences. They did a lot more of these bad behaviors, right? There's something about the people who are rated particularly low that are doing a lot more of those bad behaviors. And we've done other studies in the laboratory where we give people an opportunity to cheat, to lie about their performance, to earn some extra money. And there also we see that the people who are evaluated as lower on moral character in response to these questions are more likely to lie in a laboratory experiment or an online experiment where we can tell who's lying and who's not. They're also more likely to say they're doing these bad behaviors. So I think this is an interesting line of work. It's one I'd like to extend. So if you're interested in doing work in your organizations that sort of tests how these interview questions work and play out, I'd love to hear from you and partner with you on some of that work, because I think there's still a lot we can learn about what are the kinds of things people say. We know that judges or evaluators can get a sense of a person's moral character. We still have a lot to learn about what exactly do the interviewees say that gives people this clue, right? We have kind of a general sense of this person's high or low on moral character, but I think with more research, we'll learn a lot more about what to look for. So I want to close here with this slide, and then I think we may have a few minutes for questions, which feel free to put in the chat. Today, I've talked about hiring for moral character, and when I think about moral character or personality more generally, I really like this figure here. So you can imagine three people. And if the y-axis is ethical behavior, all of us have a distribution around our behavior. Some days we're having a really good day, we're doing everything right. Other days we're tired, our kids are stressing us out, and we make bad decisions, right? And so there's variability. When you hire for moral character, you're essentially hiring person one, because that person, on average, over time, across situations, is going to be doing more good behaviors, right? Fewer bad behaviors, right? But on any particular day, in the bad environment, right? If in a bad organizational culture, even the most moral employees can make the bad decisions, right? So we want to be mindful of moral character, the interview process, try and hire person one, but we also want to help bring out the best in others through our own actions, through the culture you help to create. Right? And that way, sort of bring maybe person three, person two, who on average, may not have a tendency towards behaving ethically. How do we move them in the right direction? Okay. All right, so there's my contact information, and I think we have a couple minutes if you have any questions. I think see one in the chat. So I've looked at correlation between the Gallup study about what makes a good manager and guilt-proneness, honesty, moral character. I've done reading on the Gallup study. I'm trying to think what specifically there. What I can say, I don't recall the specific characteristics in that study, but some of them certainly overlap. And in my work on moral character, I focused on guilt proneness, but also you can look at more general kinds of dimensions. So on the negative side, the dark side, you can look at things like Machiavellianism, narcissism, even psychopathy, right, in the extreme. And then on the positive side, there's a number of different characteristics. Honesty and humility are ones that I mentioned before. Selfishness, right? There's lots of different things you might get at. And there's sort of this constellation, all of them I would put under the umbrella of moral character. So let's see what else. Guilt proneness in business performance. Yes. Financial innovation. Yes. So there's actually great work by Rebecca Schomburg, University of Pennsylvania Wharton School, who has looked at a variety of firms in Silicon Valley and looked at job performance and found some positive correlations there. People who are high in guilt proneness work harder. And so there's been some published papers, also some of my own findings, where people who are higher in guilt proneness, they have the sense of responsibility, right? They have more responsible to their colleagues. They have greater commitment to the organizations. Even if they're, not feeling particularly satisfied with their job, they're still going to do the job, right? And so all of that can lead to performance. And so in general, if there's a workforce that has higher levels of moral character, you'll see a more productive workforce, right? And better interpersonal relationships too. So let's see. Any relationship between high moral character employees and the referrals they provide for open positions? Do high moral character employees recommend an associate with a? That's a really interesting question, and I don't know if we have a definitive answer to that, Andrew. Thank you. In general, there's the idea of birds of a feather flock together and similarity. Not clear how much that translates into moral character. I imagine it does to some extent, right? Because especially say if you have a high moral identity, if that's really central to who you are, and you really view the world and in terms of how ethical the decisions are, and you see that, I think it would be hard for you to associate with people who really violate those values. And so in terms of friendships, I don't know. I think it's an open question, but one I imagine people do have some similarity. When candidates know they're being evaluated, they have an incentive to fake. Would interview questions help differentiate the false positives? I think they definitely can, and this is an area where we will hope to explore further. But in one of the experiments, we incentivized people to look good, where it was a laboratory experiment where we told people whoever had the best responses would be getting a $50 bonus. So we wanted to motivate people. And the interview questions were just as predictive of cheating. In that study, it was lying about performance in the incentivized condition as the non-incentivized. So, of course, that's one study in a particular context, but it does show some promise that even when people are motivated to try and look good, something about who they are, what their character sort of leaks through. And I think that makes it a little different than, say, the self-report surveys where people can just circle 1 to 5, whereas in a behavioral interview question that asks people about their own prior experiences, you can try and make a positive impression, but the people in low and moral character, I think they may not even sort of mention the same characteristics, because those are ones they might say, well, that would make me look weak or like a sucker, or a variety of different valuations they might have. So I think there's promise that these interview questions can't totally be faked. And I'd like to do more work there to test that out further. All right. I think that is everything in the chat. And 2 minutes left.
That's perfect. So I'm going to ask if Leah, you could come on as well, just to share the notes. And again, we will share these afterwards as well. Taya, thank you for doing this. Is the email the best way for people to reach out if they want to talk to you more about
email
doing work with you, LinkedIn?
Yeah, that'd be great. Email, LinkedIn, anyway,
Any
way you
any
can get
network
in
that you
touch.
can find you?
There's lots
Okay.
of ways. We'll send me an email. We can set up a Zoom call or something else. Thank you.